news about Grossman. Patricia wondered if it more than just a coincidence that every one of the female architects promoted to the level of associate or partner were the same physical type. You could say I come into the same category. For that matter, so does Patricia. She's far and away my closest friend in the office, although in my experience work friendships are usually very superficial. Let's face it, however well we get on, we're inevitably in competition for the next available promotion. Mind you, Patricia's never been promoted, despite being with the practice for getting on 5 years, even though she has far more ability than most of the associates, and despite being Grossman's type, allegedly. She says she's deliberately avoided putting herself in certain situations. Situations which Grossman could potentially misconstrue. Basically, she makes sure she's never alone with him. He has this penthouse flat above the office, and on several occasions he's invited Patricia up there after work, on the pretext of discussing her projects. On each occasion she's made a point of taking one of the interns along. That way there wasn't the slightest possibility of any funny business. Apart from anything else, she's married. Mind you, so is Grossman. Oh, Patricia's lovely. She's warm-hearted, vivacious and very dedicated. She's the life and soul of the party. Her husband, Graham, is a very lucky man and he knows it. She's just found out she's pregnant. She and Graham have been trying for quite a while and they've had to resort to IVF. She told me the good news only last week. I don't think I've ever seen anyone so happy. The only downside is that Grossman isn't very generous when it comes to maternity leave. Mind you, he isn't very generous when it comes to anything. What else can I tell you about him? Well, he's obviously a very successful architect. He's built up the practice from nothing, and now it's one of the biggest in London. He's not the world's greatest designer, but he is very good at networking, and his main role in the practice is attracting and entertaining the clients, usually at various lap dancing joints from what I hear. When you see him with the clients, he's all very obsequious, but with us employees he's nothing but a foul-mouthed bully. If anyone makes the slightest mistake, he'll shout at them in front of everyone, making very liberal use of the C-word. He makes you feel really small, and he doesn't like it at all if you answer back. He's been known to throw things as well. And he's a skinflint. We have a massive turnover of interns working all hours for no wages whatsoever, and they hardly ever get taken on permanently. And the rest of us get paid an absolute pittance. Grossman takes the attitude that architecture is a vocation. We shouldn't be in it for the money, and we should be grateful to have any kind of job in this current climate. We're contracted to work from 9 to 5:30, but if anyone dares leave before 7, they get a dirty look from Grossman. If they do that often enough, he brands them a 9 to 5 architect, and they soon get their marching orders. And there's no such thing as overtime in this job. We're expected to work till after 7 virtually every evening, and we even have to come in at the weekends if the project demands it, which they often do on account of the way he allocates man hours. Person hours. In fact, there are twice as many women in the office as men. Of course, Grossman does all the interviewing, which probably explains why we're all the same physical type. And I'm sure he thinks he can get away with paying us a fraction of what he would have to pay men. Unfortunately, he probably can. He thinks we're all being supported by our husbands and boyfriends with better paid jobs, but that is certainly not my situation. But Grossman does very well out of it, thank you very much. Apart from the penthouse, he has a mansion in Hampstead, a cottage in the Cotswolds, a brand new Aston Martin and 3 kids at top public schools. I don't care so much about the material trappings, but one way or another I'd certainly like to be running my own practice when I get to his age. I've wanted to be an architect as long as I can remember. It runs in the family. My dad and my younger brother Jason are architects as well. My dad has a small practice in Runcorn, and he's always wanted Jason to work there and eventually take over. Despite being the oldest, there were never any talk of me going into the practice. The emphasis was always on Jason's education and career. He gets to go to this posh private school, and I have to settle for the local comprehensive. My dad's what you might call a social conservative, which is a nice way of saying he has a problem with anyone who's in any way different to himself. He was an old dad, over 50 when I was born, so he was set in his ways well before the era of the new man. Mind you, that didn't last long. Sexism just skipped a generation and then laddish culture came back with a vengeance. I blame Jeremy Clarkson. My dad never expected me to do anything other than get married and provide him with grandchildren. Even now he takes no interest in my professional life. Last time we spoke I was complaining about the glass ceiling at work, and all he could say was how it must be awfully difficult to keep clean. He obviously thinks it's my job to get up there with a duster. The best thing you could say about Jason is that he's a medium-sized fish in a very small pond. Well, one way or another, I'm aiming to be a very big fish in a very big pond. But it isn't easy for a woman to get on in architecture. It's a highly competitive profession. So, despite what I think about Grossman, if being nice to him is all it takes to get a step up the ladder, then why not? If you find yourself back at a man's place, some people seem to see it as a tacit acceptance that something's going to happen. Of course, that's a strong possibility under the circumstances, but we're perfectly entitled to change our mind. I've been in that situation a few times. More often than not, it's when something suddenly turns me off. It might be his aftershave, or an unfortunate taste in home furnishings. Well, whatever the reason, on the spur of the moment I make the decision that I'm absolutely not going any further. Now I know I've got to be careful how I handle the situation, because I don't want to hurt his feelings or create a bad atmosphere. So I tell him quite clearly how he mustn't assume that by coming back to his place I've agreed to have sex. I tell him I'm not that kind of girl, even though sometimes I am. No, I say I've agreed to your invitation so that we can get to know each other better and, if things work out, of course, move on to the physical side on a future occasion. Of course, there probably won't be a future occasion unless he ditches his aftershave or pays a visit to IKEA. The Me Too movement wants to portray all women as victims. But short of being physically overpowered, I honestly can't see how any sensible woman with a modicum of backbone can't handle these situations. Now Ingrid, one of the associates, is going to be leaving next month. So this could be an ideal opportunity for me. So I sent Grossman an email asking for his opinion on 3 design options I've been working on for a new boutique hotel in Knightsbridge. It was a reasonable request because he's done a few projects in the area and he knows very well what's likely to get past the planners. It didn't come as any surprise when he invited me up to the penthouse. He said he had a few thoughts on the hotel, but he was in a series of meetings, so there would be no opportunity to discuss the project until 9:30, if I didn't mind stopping late. So, that evening, I gathered my sketches and took the lift to the penthouse. Of course, the lights were subdued, and there was Grossman in a t-shirt and shorts. Like a lot of men these days, if he's not in a suit, he generally dresses like a toddler. He's 50 if he's a day. He's a very unattractive man by any standard, and judging by the photos about the place, he was no better looking when he was younger. It's difficult to imagine any woman ever being physically attracted to him. I suppose that's why he's had to resort to seducing his employees. He knows he might just stand half a chance with them, for obvious reasons. You hear that some men get rejected so often, they eventually come to despise women, so if they find themselves in a position of power, they end up treating us as objects for their own gratification. Mind you, when you think about it, some of those actors that got in trouble with the Me Too movement are actually very good looking. You wonder if in their case it's all about a sense of entitlement. They expect women to fall at their feet. Perhaps it has nothing to do with how a man looks. Maybe most men, given half a chance, would take advantage of the position of power in much the same way. Or look at what's been going on in the Church of England, or the Catholic Church for that matter. Anyway, Grossman asked me to lay out my sketches on this low glass-top table and invites me to sit down on his white leather sofa. He says he's just opened a bottle of Chardonnay and would I like a glass? So I accept. He sits down beside me and I explain my ideas for the hotel. He's supposed to be looking at my sketches, but as I lean over the table, he seems to be paying more attention to my cleavage. Well, I wasn't buttoned right up. Still, he has some quite useful observations to make and he praised my ideas, and then he starts asking me about myself, about where I studied architecture, where I saw my career going, that sort of thing. Of course, he mentions about Ingrid leaving. By this time, I'm on my second glass of Chardonnay, so I ask to use the bathroom. While I'm in there, I take the opportunity to undo a couple more shirt buttons, and when I go back in to sit down, I notice he's moved to the middle of the sofa, so I have to squeeze in beside him. He starts going on about his ambitions for the practice, and how someone like me could play a big part in its future. As he's talking, he casually touches my shoulder, and I don't say anything, so his next move is to rest his hand on my knee. I was wearing quite tight-fitting jeans. Unless we're meeting clients, we tend to be a very casual office. I don't object, and then he says he hopes I don't mind him mentioning it, but he couldn't help but notice that I have an exceptional bottom. Can you believe it? An exceptional bottom? Well, frankly, I was a bit shocked, but I said I don't mind at all. It's nice to receive compliments. He said he's sometimes wary of complimenting women in the office, in case his comments get misconstrued. I said, I'm sure no one would jump to the wrong conclusion about a comment like that, although they might well jump to the right one. It's one thing to compliment a woman's blouse, but her bottom is an entirely different matter. He said men have to be really careful these days on account of the Me Too movement. I told him how I've no time for all that, and how I know what side my bread's buttered on. He mentions how he can't even pat a female colleague on the back for fear of being accused of touching her inappropriately. I said that's ridiculous, and I wouldn't mind at all if you touched me inappropriately. He didn't need a second invitation. To my mind, this whole Me Too thing stems from the simple fact that despite decades of feminism, it's still usually the man that's expected to make the first move, to be the seducer. So with the onus on men, it's hardly surprising they get it wrong from time to time. In an ideal world, it would be perfectly acceptable for a woman to initiate things, but we're seen to be easy or desperate if we do, and we can even put a man off if we come on too strong. So that's the root of the problem. Of course, there's the matter of men's superior physical strength. That's the other significant factor. But there's not much we can do about that unless every woman on the planet becomes a black belt in judo or something. So for men, there's obviously a fine line between being proactive and overstepping the mark. Yeah, we want them to make the first move, but if we're not responsive, they need to back off. In other words, no means no, even when it might mean maybe or not just yet. When Patricia heard I'm going to be made an associate, she was obviously a bit taken aback, but she tried not to show it. She rather pointedly asked me about what had happened when I went up to the penthouse. I said that Grossman was the perfect gentleman, and how those rumours about him preying on female employees were nothing more than gossip and tittle-tattle. Well, I didn't want Patricia or anyone else knowing my promotion was based on anything other than merit and experience. Well, it was based on experience, just not one I'd want to repeat in a hurry. Patricia obviously believed me, because the next time he invited her up to the penthouse, she didn't feel the need to take an intern along with her. I feel a bit guilty about what happened next. Put it this way, Patricia didn't come into work the next day, or any day since for that matter. Just as soon as I'd arrived in the office, Grossman comes over. He's obviously a bit worried about something, and he wants to know if I'd said anything to Patricia about what had happened between us. I said I hadn't, and he looked a bit surprised. He said he thought women usually talk about that kind of thing. Anyway, the police arrived around lunchtime and took Grossman away in handcuffs. I was interviewed along with everyone else in the office. They asked me about my own experiences with Grossman, but under the circumstances I could only repeat what I'd told Patricia. I'm sure I wasn't the only one in that situation. It seems very likely there were others who'd benefited from a liaison with Grossman. But even now I don't know for certain. You see, although there are always plenty of rumours and gossip, nothing was ever admitted. But one intern did come forward and tell police how Grossman had made some clumsy advances. But when she rebuffed him, he gave up immediately, and even apologised after a fashion. Under the circumstances, it says something she managed to keep her job. The thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if Grossman was emboldened by what had happened between us. I'm guessing he thought Patricia was also fair game, especially when she turned up without an intern in tow. He knew we were friends, and he'd obviously assumed that I told her all about what had happened between us. I've tried contacting Patricia on numerous occasions, but she's not answering my messages, which isn't like her at all. Any intelligent, sensitive man should be able to tell exactly how far a woman is prepared to go. It's not just what we say, it's our body language and all our other non-verbal signals. It's all about communication. There really shouldn't be any room for misunderstanding. Now, I know there are some men who are incapable of reading a woman's signals or unwilling to accept them, they are either arrogant or ignorant, or more commonly both. Unless there's something in it for me, I generally avoid that sort altogether. You can spot them a mile off, full of machismo and bravado. They tend to be the competitive, aggressive types. Quite often the ones who've done well for themselves. Career-wise, I mean. Well, let's face it, the world we live in rewards that type of man. The gentler, more reflective types don't get a look in. So if a woman is looking for a successful man to provide for her, she tends to gravitate towards the assertive, thrusting, arrogant type and ends up paying the price one way or another. The trouble is, once you get a couple of drinks in them, even a new man can turn into a sex fiend. It's as if deep down the beast is there in all men just waiting to be unleashed. I think it's something to do with the way they're brought up. Have you ever noticed how the very worst insult you could throw at a boy is to call him a sissy or a pussy, which basically means to act like a girl? Is that the first step down the road to misogyny? We encourage boys to be assertive and aggressive and determined to overcome all obstacles. But what if the thing they are determined to overcome is the resistance of women? My dad often reminds us how he badgered my mum for months before she eventually gave in and agreed to go out with him. I suppose he thinks this is a charming illustration of perseverance, even devotion. But it could equally be seen as an example of a man refusing to take no for an answer. Well, it eventually went to trial. The office was closed for the duration, so I managed to attend most of it. I think Grossman thought I was there to support him. I'm not sure what Patricia thought. She certainly wouldn't catch my eye in the courtroom. Anyway, it was very much a case of her word against his, which is apparently what rape cases usually boil down to. That must be why it's so difficult to get a conviction. Of course, Grossman had the most expensive lawyers he could find, and Patricia was on legal aid. Her barrister was neither use nor ornament. Legal hindrance would have been a more appropriate term. Grossman's barrister said Patricia was making a mountain out of a molehill. Two of the associates, Laura and Michelle, testified to Grossman's good character. At the time I thought, well, they would, wouldn't they? I'm glad they didn't ask me. Surprisingly, the other defence witness was the intern who'd escaped Grossman's clutches. The barrister made a lot of the fact that she came away completely unscathed and with an apology to boot. He went on about how she still worked at the practice and hadn't suffered any repercussions. He claimed Patricia's situation was very much the same. There was no physical evidence of rape. Apparently there usually isn't in these cases. Grossman's barrister made a lot of the fact that she didn't go straight to the police that night. He said it was significant she'd waited until halfway through the following morning. I don't see what that's got to do with anything. He pointed out Patricia had willingly entered Grossman's private flat very late in the evening, and he went on at great length about her scanty clothes. They even produced them in court. The jury handed them round. It must have been very embarrassing for Patricia. Well, it was the hottest August on record, and the old skinflint refused to provide us with air conditioning. Everyone in the office was in scanty clothes at the time. I felt like saying something about that, but it was probably too late by then. When the defence barrister cross-examined Patricia, he implied she had loose morals and had been angling for a promotion. He eventually reduced her to tears. So, to cut a long story short, Grossman was completely exonerated and he was back in the office the next day. That evening, everyone in the office went down to the Queen's Head to celebrate. We all had a lot to drink, so I took the opportunity to ask Laura if she'd ever been propositioned by Grossman. She told me it was very much the same as with the intern. She'd rebuffed his advances and it didn't go any further. Apparently the same thing happened with Ingrid and with Michelle. So, it looks like I was the only one to actually go through with it. Which, I have to say, is a bit of a surprise. It turns out Grossman's suing both Patricia and the police for defamation of character. The last I heard, Patricia's had a nervous breakdown. She's had a miscarriage. And on 2 occasions at least, she's tried to take her own life. Well, if there's one thing this whole business has taught me is that we all react very differently to these situations. I'm expected to be made a partner before too long, and Patricia is in a secure hospital ward under 24-hour watch. It's very sad, but what can you do?